The next thing we're going to talk about is buying on margin. And this is a levered position in which I only put a part of the purchase price and I borrow the rest from the broker. So I'm going to be buying stock on leverage. I must do this through a brokerage account. And so I'm going to open an account with E-Trade or Schwab or some other brokerage firm. And then I'm going to buy stock, but I'm only going to put a part of the money. And here's what we're going to do. We're going to examine these long and then eventually short levered trading positions using just a very simple balance sheet. And this is going to be the investor's balance sheet that we're going to be looking at. And the idea is that you open an account, and the account has assets, liability, and equity. And note in this particular case, the word equity refers to the owner's equity of the brokerage account. This is the residual value that the trader gets to keep. Remember, the word equity is also a synonym for the word stock, but here equity refers to the balance sheet equity in the account. And what we're going to do is we're going to look at the percent change in the value of the stock relative to the percent change in the value of the equity in the account to see how this leverage works. So here's our first example. Our very first example is that we're going to deposit $80 in a brokerage account. And for now, we're just going to do a single stock, make it nice and simple. And so I'm going to put $80 in cash in a brokerage account. And so there's $80 in cash. That's the asset that's in the account. And the liability and the equity, well, there are no liabilities. On the residual value of the account is the $80. And which just happens to be offsetting this cash of $80. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to buy a stock using the cash that you just deposited and borrowed money. And for now, we'll just assume one share at $100. And the way this works is I need to set up my account so I'm allowed to do this, but I just go in and I buy a stock, and the brokerage account realizes that I just bought a stock that costs $100. I only have $80 in the account. So that $80 in cash is gone. So cash goes to zero. The value of the stock is $100, and they immediately loan me $20, and we'll talk about the rate at which they loan. So note that equity hasn't changed. It's 100 minus 20, which is 80. And I'm going to count my I'm going to compute my long position margin, the margin rate, and this is how we do this. It's equity divided by the asset. It's the equity divided by the value of the position, which in this case is $80 divided by $100. And so we define the leverage in this account as 80% margin. Now note, if this were a house, for whatever reason, we wouldn't do equity divided by stock. We would do loan to value, and we would have a 20% measure of leverage. Or if this were a corporation, we would do debt relative to equity, and we would have 0.25 debt to equity. But in this case, for whatever reason, for these accounts, the leverage measure is equity relative to in this particular case, the stock position, the asset, and that's 80% margin. And the most I can do, the limit is going to be 50% margin, meaning that I can put up half the money. If I had only had $50 in cash in the account and I bought a $100 stock, then I would have ended up borrowing 50. I would have had 50 in equity. And so my long position margin rate would have been 50 over 100 or 50%. And that is the minimum. I'm not allowed by SEC rule to borrow more than half. The other way to say that is that if I put up $50, I can only buy $100 worth of stock, 2-to-1. Okay, now here again, I have put up 80, I've borrowed 20, I own a $100 stock. Let's see what happens when the stock price changes. Let's see what happens to the equity. And for now, this is going to happen instantly. There are going to be no dividends paid on the stock and no interest will accrue on the loan. Later, we'll relax that and see how this affects this. So assume the stock price immediately increases from $100 to $110. So a 10% increase in the value of the stock. Let's look at our balance sheet. So the stock has gone from 100 to 110. That's the value of the asset. The loan hasn't changed, but the equity, which is still assets minus liabilities, is now $90. I could sell the stock for $110, pay off the $20 loan, and I would have $90 in residual value. Well, let's look at the equity return. Let's look at the stock return first, then the equity return. The stock return is 110 divided by 100 is 10%. The equity return, well, it's 90 divided by 80 is 12.5%. And if you notice, the ratio of the stock return 10% to the equity return 12.5% is equal to the margin rate. We can also describe this by looking at the return to the equity divided by the return to the stock, and we would get a 1.25% leverage ratio. So I'm leveraged at 1.25. And my new long position margin is now 90 divided by 110. My margin rate has actually increased from 80% margin to 81.81% margin. Let's look at a different example. Now, instead of funding the brokerage account with $80, I'm going to fund the brokerage account with $50. I'm going to deposit $50 in the brokerage account. And so now I have 50 in cash and 50 in equity. And I'm going to buy $100 worth of stock using the cash and now the borrowed money of $50. And so my margin rate is 50 divided by 100. It's this 50 right here, the equity, divided by this 100, the value of the position, and I have a 50% margin rate. And remember, that's the minimum. If I were to borrow more money and put up less, I would have 40 over 100. That's 40%. Can't do that. I would be over levered. Now, assume the stock price immediately decreases from 100 to 80. Okay, so now I can see that the stock went from 100 down to 80, and my equity went from 50 down to 30. And so now I can see the stock return was minus 20%, but my equity return was minus 40%. Because now I'm levered 2 to 1, or I have a 50% margin rate. And the minus 20 over the minus 40, or the minus 40 over the minus 20 give me these values. And note, this is very important, my new margin rate, which is 30 divided by 80, is now 37.50. So my margin rate has decreased. I had a $50 loan backed by $100 worth of liquid assets. Now I have a $50 loan backed by only $80 worth of liquid assets. The loan has less collateral than it had before.